Right, so we are now recording. So welcome everyone to our weekly call. I hope you had a good, relaxing weekend. If I share my screen, yeah, which I've now done. Okay, so quick intro. What we're going to do today is mainly concentrate on a review of some of the highlights from the recent IETF 119 meeting. I'll certainly share a few thoughts from things that sort of stuck in my mind with regards to some of the more notable discussions through the week, and we'll welcome any input from anyone else that attended either in person or virtually as I sort of run through the agenda. So feel free to interrupt me as we do so. And then, as always, time permitting, I'll talk about some of the sort of recent developments, forthcoming events, etc. And if anyone's got anything you want to share, hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end for any other business as well. Oh, wrong way, apologies. Okay, so without further ado, and what I'm going to do format wise, for if those of you that were on the preview call the week before the IETF meeting, I'm essentially going to sort of use the slides from that, but just annotate them with some thoughts from some of the more interesting sessions. Yeah, so kicking off, and I realise there's a mistake on the first slide, which is poor. So not the 15th, the 5th of November, but this is from the 17th of March. Apologies. The first session that I joined, a sort of traditional one, other than the hackathon on the Sunday morning of the IETF, it was the Internet Engineering and Planning Group meeting, IEPG. Which covered some interesting topics in the course of 2 hours. The one that stood out for me, Jeff Houston, who can be relied on to give interesting presentations, shared his presentation on IPv6 and DNS. And to summarize in about a sentence, about a half hour's worth of presentation from Jeff, basically was highlighting that if you had an IPv6 only resolver, you'd expect to miss at least a third of the current traffic for various reasons, and there might be issues with some of the rest. Basically you couldn't at the moment not support sort of dual stack IPv4, IPv6. Otherwise, a lot of queries would go astray somewhere within the DNS ecosystem. Obviously, those of you that know Jeff will know that he always has copious amounts of data to support his observations, which he duly did. So if you haven't seen that presentation, which he also gave, I think it was at the OARC meeting, if I remember rightly. I've certainly seen him give it somewhere else recently. But it's definitely worth catching up with if you haven't seen that presentation previously, if you have an interest in DNS matters. So I'd certainly recommend that. And inevitably with all this, I am only going to pull out one or two observations from the sessions that I'm going to comment on. So there's a whole bunch of other interesting presentations and discussions in the 2 hours of the IEPG, but Jeff's IPv6 and the DNS presentation was the highlight of that for me. I'll just pause there in case anyone that was that did attend either in person or remotely so also sat in on that and had anything that you wanted to observe either on Jeff's presentation or indeed on anything else. I'm not seeing anyone unmute, so I'm assuming not. So as I say, as I roll through, if anyone's got anything to add, just sort of raise your virtual hand or just interrupt me as we run through, and sort of share your insights as well. Okay, looking at the agenda for the Monday, first sort of full day of the meeting proper. The first session on the Monday was an experiment. So the IETF combined all its various dispatch groups into a single session, and that was the only thing on the agenda for session one on Monday. I think they're going to continue with the experiment in Vancouver and then review. So I won't comment on the various sort of different presentations that were given, but personally, I thought it was a useful experiment and is certainly worth persevering with. But it does need further work to make sure that the people that have asked for time understand the purpose, the primary purpose of asking for time is to get guidance and preferably a decision on where to dispatch something to for further discussion and potentially work. Because some of the slots they did have quite a lot of presentation material about what the subject matter was, well beyond what you might need to know in order to help give guidance on a dispatch decision. One of the sessions I think actually had something like 42 slides, which for, was well beyond I think what was sensible for that type of discussion. But in fairness, it was an experiment, so I guess there'll be sort of a bit of learning on all sides, including by the chairs, who probably need to do more gating of what material is provided. But I suspect there'll be some fine tuning, but I'd be surprised if we don't continue with this as the first session for future meetings. I think the logic of putting it there is potentially that something that's dispatched to a working group that's meeting during the week may well find that their subject is accommodated within that working group meeting if there's time on the agenda to do so. Okay, then looking at session two, you'll see I highlighted three different working groups of the measurement and analysis protocols, the WIMSI workload identity in multi-system environments, BOF, and also the network management operations working group. Of those, I only went to the last one, the network management operations working group. Thought it was quite a useful working group. The thing I've highlighted there in light blue on the slide, it is one of the presentations was about collecting operator requirements for IETF network management solutions, which fits with the charter of the working group, which is to, as you can see on the left hand side of this slide, to solicit input from network operators, something which in my view has been sadly lacking from a lot of IETF discussions over the last few years. So I think it's incredibly positive that such a working group has been created, and part of its charter is to get that sort of operational input rather than creating things in a vacuum. So I'd certainly urge anyone working for a network operator on this call, take a look at that and either see if there's anything you want to provide yourself or maybe steer colleagues towards it if it's not your area of expertise. But yeah, I thought it was a good and interesting development to see that one. I'm not probably going to add much on any of the other sessions that would be particularly useful. So again, I'll just pause there and see if anyone has got anything you want to add to any of those ones. continue moving on. So do interrupt me if you do. Again, nothing really jumped out at me that's probably useful to say from the IETF Open or the OHI working groups at the back end of the Monday. I went to the OHI working group, was quite useful. Progress being made on OHI, but nothing particularly sort of stands out. I think it's useful for me to highlight. So I'll move on to Tuesday, which kicked off for me with the DNS delegation or Deleg BOF, which you'll recall we've discussed Deleg on this call previously. It's something which originally arose in the last IETF meetings hackathon, and as was followed up with presentations at RIPE and the OARC meetings amongst others since. It was quite useful, I'd say, in sort of setting out the stall on what the proposition was and why it would be useful to have a working group. And I think the conclusion from the BOF was more work is needed on the charter, which is no great surprise as any sort of put forward fairly shortly before the call, and potentially there will be a second BOF after that work has taken place. So probably a second BOF in Vancouver, but only if there's been substantive discussion and tuning of the proposed charter in the meantime. But my sense is that that probably will ultimately go through to a working group, if just to sort of suggest the likely outcome. I think that's quite probable at this stage. So interrupt me if you've got anything to add to that, but I'll sort of continue on. The second BOF on Tuesday was the SPICE Secure Patterns for Internet Credentials BOF, which that did have a BOF in the last meeting in Prague. So this was the sort of follow-up from that. Seemed to be making further progress. I mean, inevitably with the sort of the BOF discussions, it wasn't totally clear at all places, but the sort of literally the very last comment in the notes, because I checked them earlier today, so the last comment in the notes from the meeting, that is, Paul Wouters, the one of the security area directors, basically said, happy this is finalized, it now goes into the IESG review. So in essence, they're reviewing the sort of what happens next with it in terms of will it form an actual working group. Again, my suspicion is that it will do, but we'll see what the ISG concludes on that. It may even have done so. To be fair, there has been the regular ISG sort of audio conference since, which I haven't had a chance to look at the notes yet, so they may have covered that in that. I don't know if they have either way. Okay, I think that was all I was going to comment on, just those two BOF ones from the Tuesday. So shout out if you think I've missed anything vital, or indeed something, not even necessarily any of the things mentioned on the screen. If you sort of dipped into something other than any of these. But otherwise, I'll move on to the Wednesday. And I'll comment on a couple of, again, of the sessions from the Wednesday. The first was the IAB open meeting, which sort of started off by giving feedback from some of the recent workshops that the IAB has hosted. I've highlighted the last of those, the bias workshop, and I put some additional comments on the right hand side of the slide for those of you that are looking at your screens. So the bias workshop covered 3 areas, one of which was censorship, which was defined in the workshop. Bear in mind that the IB Open meeting, this was just a report back of some of the key points from the workshop. So they defined censorship as the legal control or suppression of what can be accessed, published or viewed on the internet. And additionally added that the community could also explore if a censorship and its circumvention focus group could be created. I did comment on the mic that I think that we need to be very cautious in this area, because that definition of censorship would, for example, cover potentially government mandated blocking of access to child sex abuse material or malicious content. And clearly, if that's the case, I'm not sure that the community would want to work on ways to circumvent that type of censorship. So I think potentially any proposal coming out of that workshop would need to be worded very tightly to be clear what is focused on. Otherwise, it could move into quite problematic areas, in my view. And then following on from those various reports, there was an invited talk by Vanessa Teague, an academic at the Australian National University based in Melbourne. Her talk was titled Techniques for Detecting Known Illegal Material with End-to-End Encrypted Communications. Do they work? Are they secure? Which is a bit of a mouthful. In essence, she was effectively building on a paper that was published a while ago called Bugs in Your Pockets, which was critiquing some proposals around so-called client-side scanning, largely based on proposals from Apple from a couple of years or so ago to scan files stored on iCloud to identify any potential, again, child sex abuse material stored on iCloud. So Vanessa's presentation was very useful, definitely well worth watching. I would say, though, that I think the issue it suffered from slightly, and which is also the case with the Bugs in Our Pockets paper, was it created a straw man mechanism or implementation of client-side scanning, which it then proceeded to critique. My understanding, talking to various people who are very knowledgeable in this area, is a lot of the issues identified are known issues and can be overcome by not implementing client-side scanning in that way. So in other words, if you implement something badly, it's no great surprise if there are problems with the implementation. So don't do that. Do it properly. But anyway, nevertheless, I think it's a good presentation. She's a good presenter, and it's definitely well worth watching, albeit I think there may be some flaws, but they're because of some assumptions about the way you'd implement client-side scanning. Then moving on, the other session I mentioned from the Wednesday was the RASP research group. That's the Research Analysis of Standard Setting Processes Proposed research group, which is a real mouthful. That had, again, a series of useful presentations. The one that I just wanted to mention, or coincidentally also by Jeff Houston, who I mentioned from the Sunday, was titled Making of an RFC in Today's IETF. Basically Jeff sort of just looked at stats. He pulled off the IETF's data tracker, which amongst other things we're charting how long it takes end to end in the process to deliver an RFC. And his conclusion is it's roughly doubled over the last couple of decades or so, and typically now takes between 6 and 8 years on average to get an RFC from the first idea as a sort of first draft, sort of 00 draft of a sort of 00 internet draft, right the way through to the published RFC. So that's quite a long amount of time, I think. Um, it did get some pushback on the mic queue, in particular from Colin Perkins, the chair of the IETF. But I think Jeff was trying to, I think, politely make the point that he wasn't drawing any conclusions from this, simply looking at the data and presenting what it told him, letting others draw conclusions. Whereas I think Colin inferred a criticism, probably not unreasonably, but it wasn't one that I don't recall that Jeff actually made directly. He was leaving that to the reader to decide what they made of that sort of time frame. And there were good reasons for it, because as I think Colin may have said, at the early days of the IETF, you didn't have to worry so much about working with legacy protocols because they weren't there. So things are more complicated now than perhaps they were at the start, which I think is a fair comment. But anyway, again, if like me, those are things you're interested in, that's worth watching the recording if you have about half an hour to do so. Okay, moving on to the Thursday. I would certainly recommend watching the recording of the SCONE protocol, the most contrived acronym that I've seen for some considerable time, to be fair, the Securely Communicating Network Properties to Clients protocol. It was a BOF, Birds of a Feather session, and it was looking at the whether there was a need for a mechanism for networks to give hints to clients that they could, or to endpoints that they could choose to react to, optionally choose. So not that they were required to react to, but they could. And the example use case in some of the draft documentation that was given was on a mobile network providing hints that there may be constrained bandwidth to an endpoint might be useful, because it may then choose to adapt sort of what it does. It led to an interesting discussion in the BOF session. There were mixed views whether this was a useful thing to do or not. I think some people maintaining that some protocols do that anyway, so you don't need an overarching protocol for that. But of course, what that don't have at the moment is a mechanism for the network to tell, say, I don't know, Netflix, your Netflix client, that there's constrained bandwidth. The client's having to work it out for itself. So I think this is a slightly different use case. I thought on the left-hand side, because there wasn't enough space, otherwise, that show hands at the end. 51 people thought that it would be useful to have a work group on this topic based on the discussion so far. 20 that it wouldn't, and a further 12 were undecided. That's of the people that actually committed on Meet Echo to an opinion one way or another. And as you can see, that was roughly half of the people that were in Meet Echo that actually ventured up an opinion of any description. So I think there's definitely still work to be done, including on a charter, which we didn't discuss in the BOF session. Mixed views on it, but I mean the majority clearly that expressed an opinion thought that it was a useful topic, but there was nevertheless a reasonably sizable percentage that thought differently. So definitely more work to be done before you could conclude there was rough consensus to do something on this. I then went to the decentralization of the Internet Research Group, DIN-RG. I won't try and summarise the discussion. I draw your attention in particular to a presentation on the cyberspace regulation case study. In terms of, sort of centralisation topics, I would say that's worth a look at either the slides and or listen to the recording if you weren't there and had an interest in that general subject area. And then finally on the Thursday, we had the ADD, Adaptive DNS Discovery session. In fact, we had two. There was one earlier in the day. There was an hour in the morning, and then further sort of time on the agenda in the afternoon. Covered a number of documents in progress, but the thing I wanted to highlight in particular, the chairs were keen for us to have what they phrase an architectural directions discussion, which was about as you can see on the left hand side, because it was sort of flagged beforehand, the sort of architectural design philosophy focused on security, trust and service identity, and how that should be done. There wasn't consensus in the discussion, but I think the chairs, as you see on the right, the text I've highlighted, are going to continue the debate on the ADD list, to really pushing that the work group work on what the problem statement is, and preferably have something on that sort of much further developed before the next IETF meeting. The reason why they focus on the problem statement, there were differences of view whether the subject was appropriate to be discussed within the ADD working group. But I think there was acceptance it was appropriate to at least try and scope out what the problem statement was, even if the ADD group wasn't necessarily the right venue to work on what a solution might be. And I think some views expressed during discussion that maybe it would need a buff or something similar, or would be a topic that will be better addressed in a different existing working group. So I think that's one of those two is the most likely outcome, but again, I think it'd be worth your while just tracking that discussion on the ADD mailing list in the meantime. Okay, and then finally, two things I'll mention on the Friday. Firstly, the SRv6 operations BOF, which was quite well attended given it's Friday morning, including by a reasonable number of people working for network operators, I believe. And there was a sort of a reasonable discussion on the topic. Definitely not a consensus emerging at this stage whether it would be useful to move ahead and form a working group on this topic. There was maybe marginally more people in favour of that than against that expressed a view, I think, in the room, but certainly nothing close to what could be reasonably deemed sort of rough consensus on it. What was interesting, there was a sort of clear signals coming from I think the ADs and some of the IB members that were present, that there was a willingness in principle to make agenda time for another topic that was relevant to network operators, but it was unclear whether there was sufficient support from the network operators that were represented in the room that was a good thing or not. So if you work for a network operator and have an opinion, that will be worth sort of taking a look at either way. But if you're like stepping back from the subject matter, the fact that there's this is another signal from the sort of the IETF leadership that there's willingness to make agenda time available to network operators, I think is a positive and quite interesting. That's been repeated a number of times in a number of different areas. And then the final observations from me on this on the agenda will be DNS Ops, which had the second of its two meetings in the last slot on the Friday. The only observation I make is, as always, the DNS Ops meeting, or meetings plural, covered an enormous amount of ground, giving updates on progress with a lot of different drafts. So for all of us that have an interest in the DNS area, that's definitely worth your while catching up on. And if you've not seen it, I posted a link on the weekly headlines last week to an article. There's a blog post after the meeting that Jeff Houston put up on the APNIC blog with a roundup of DNS sort of discussions from the IETF meeting, and he focused specifically on the DNS ops meetings plus the Deleg BOF. So those of you that focus on DNS, definitely take a look at Jeff's blog post for a helpful summary of all of the ground that was covered. And let me again pause there for anyone that was at the meeting, if you want to jump in with anything that you think I've either overlooked or that you want to add to that I've already mentioned, if you have. So if you do, just unmute and talk, or pop something in the chat if that's easier. I'll just pause for a few seconds to see if anyone does. Not looking like it at the moment. In which case, well, hopefully for those of you that weren't there, hopefully that was useful, just to sort of point you towards a few things that might be worth some of your time by way of follow-up after this call, to sort of home in on, rather than trying to catch up with a week's worth of stuff, which would take a long time. So hope that was useful. And then we wrapped up and went our merry ways, as I did with some of you will be aware. I managed to get a sort of a long weekend in New Zealand prior to heading home, which I would recommend to anyone, not necessarily as a long weekend, but as a destination, if you ever have the privilege of being able to do so. Right, okay, then just move swiftly on and talk for a short while about some of the headlines from the last week. And as always, I'm not going to go through all of these at length, but if you're not caught up on it, it's definitely worth catching up on some of the coverage about Google's VPN app within the Google One sort of package. I think which I characterize loosely as Google's equivalent to Apple's iCloud Plus package. There's a VPN within it, and based on the coverage, it stands accused of changing the settings on endpoints so that it always uses Google's DNS, whether the Google VPN is on or off, overwriting any pre-existing settings, and it's quite persistent that it will, if you switch it off manually, it seems to manage to reactivate itself. So if you're not seeing that will definitely be worth your while taking a look at when you have time. I suspect there's going to be some repercussions from that if all the various sort of indications are validated, and there seems to be quite a lot of indication that there is validity in the coverage, so definitely worth a look. The other thing I'll mention sort of for a moment, third name check for Jeff Houston this week. Just by chance, on Monday, I managed to catch up with a podcast that Jeff recorded with George Michelson a few days back, which was, well, personally I found really interesting. It's about an hour long. It sort of delves into the history of the IETF and the differences with some of the other standards groups. In fact, it goes a lot further back than the start of the IETF, as it happens to look at the evolution of the sector more generally, before considering the history of the IETF and its evolution and its culture and some of the reasons for the culture, and leads right the way up to the potential involvement of the European Commission within the community, which is what provoked this particular podcast in the first place. A story about the Commission wanting to get involved in it. Yeah, for anyone with a history with an interest in the background to the IETF, I think you find that quite easy listening to perhaps sort of catch up with over a lunchtime or something. So definitely worth a listen, in my view. And then just the bottom one on this slide, a very good write-up by Dr. Hayat Schulman, an academic with, I think it's a German university, if I remember rightly. And Haya was part of a team that covered the key trap a vulnerability in DNSSEC a couple of months ago, and she's sort of writing about the risk of abuse of so-called dangling DNS records. So just highlighting a sort of potential weakness in some of the cloud platforms and other services. So again, some of you will find that useful. Apologies, ignore that slide. Other items of interest, there's plenty of other stuff this week. I definitely won't go through all of these, but there's quite a few interesting policy ones. Probably the one I'll highlight is there's a sort of a so-called zero draft being developed on the Global Digital Compact, which is being worked up within civil society. So if you have an interest on the policy side, you may find that useful. That's the second link down. And then by way of contrast, I'll just mention the one at the bottom, which is a story on Microsoft and Quantinuum demonstrating the most reliable logical qubits on record with an error rate 800 times better than physical qubits. So anyone interested on the sort of quantum computing, that's definitely worth a look. And somebody just sort of popped me an email literally just before this call to say that's a really interesting development, and maybe is this sort of a sign of quantum computing potentially becoming useful. It doesn't fix all the problems, but it seems to basically mean that you can get consistent answers out of systems now, whereas up until now, one of the biggest issues with some of the quantum sort of demonstrators was that they were inconsistent in the answers that they gave because of the nature of the sort of the quantum element. So this paper seems to suggest that Microsoft and Quantinuum have at least solved that specific problem. So we're maybe on a runway to quantum computing actually becoming a useful tool in sort of sooner rather than later. Okay, just to highlight some impending deadlines. Mozilla got their forthcoming Rise Awards coming up, and the deadline for nominations is that Friday this week, I think. And then early next week, the IETF, their Applied Networking Research Workshop, they've got a deadline of the 15th for potential research submissions to be made. And then you'll see there's a sort of few other deadlines sort of rolling through. Probably the one I'll mention, fourth one down, the DNS working group at RIPE. They got a call for presentations. I thought that would have ended in the next few days, but one of the co-chairs put a message out last week suggesting that the deadline is the 6th of May. So you've got a little bit of time for that, but probably if you've got aspirations to present something at in the DNS working group at RIPE, probably want to put it in before then, because they do only have, I think, a 2-hour slot at that meeting. Okay, and then a lot of meetings coming up over the next few months. This is a list of things I've got over the next quarter, so you see there's plenty there. I've added on, now they've been finalised, the dates for Apple's WWDC meeting in Cupertino, and also Cisco Live as well. But there's a whole bunch of other things you can see in there as well as all of those. So a lot of stuff happening. Just as an aside, I think the next thing I'd like to go to is the RSAC event in San Francisco on the 6th and 9th of May. So if anyone is attending that or happens to be in the San Francisco area first full week of May, then feel free to let me know. Good to sort of meet up and say hello face to face for a change. Right, and then last thing from me, just a reminder, two other topics I've got on this call over the next few weeks. In 2 weeks' time, we'll be talking about the multi-signer model, as requested from someone on the call. So that's a topic we'll be covering in a couple of weeks' time. And then I should confirm it this week, but I'm hoping that we'll have the DELEG panel discussion at the end of this month with hopefully Paul Mokapetris, Paul Vixie, hopefully Jeff Houston, and one of the DELEG co-authors. That will probably be a slightly longer call, maybe 90 minutes to give us time to do the topic justice. And I think, yes, that is everything from me. So apologies for a lengthy diatribe. Let me stop sharing and see if anyone else has got anything that you want to add, anything perhaps I've missed out, or any other sort of news or information you want to share. And as always, just pop something in the chat or unmute and talk if that is easier, if you do. And I'll give you a few seconds to think if that's the case. Everyone's very quiet this week, it would seem. I'm not seeing any typing at the moment. I can't see any hands raised. No. No, it doesn't look like it this week, so obviously a quieter week for everyone. Okay, all right. Well, I hope that was useful. Hopefully, you pulled out a few things to follow up on from the last IETF meeting. So I'll leave you to it. Enjoy the rest of the week. Have a fantastic week, and catch up same time next week. So speak to everyone then. Thanks.